My name is Caroline McGilvery, and I'm an MBA student at MIT Sloan. It is my pleasure to introduce our panel, The Role of the Storyteller in the Data and AI World. Our panelists today are Brant Berglund, Senior Director of Coaching and GM Applications at the NHL, Rebecca Dyer, Director of Business Development and Sales at Genius Sports, Jeff Bennett, founder of ESPN Analytics, and Jackie McMullen, recipient of the 2024 Sloan Sports Analytics Conference Lifetime Achievement Award. Our panel.
Come on, thank you. So ironic.
The hard stop on that one.
Our panel today will be moderated by author Ben Alamar. The panel will run for 40 minutes, and then we'll have 5 minutes for questions. And please submit your questions through the Cadence app. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Ben.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Caroline. And thank you all for coming and spending an hour talking about data, AI, and storytelling. So there's no question that changes in data and availability have impacted the way that fans think and engage with sports. As one small example, according to data from Google Trends, searches for analytics as a sports term have increased over 1,000% in the last 20 years. So because of all that, we have a panel here, and we're very, very lucky to have this fantastic group of folks here, all with different perspectives on what storytelling is, and really discuss the intersection of sports, storytelling, data, and technology. So for the purposes of this discussion, we will take a very broad perspective on what storytelling is, whether it's deeply reported long-form stories, 30-second spot on SportsCenter, or game augmentation during a live broadcast. These are all forms of storytelling. And now, in terms of AI, we're going to talk about, when we talk about AI, what we mean is generative AI, AI that creates new things, not just discovering patterns like in traditional machine learning. So those are our definitions. Now, discussions like these can sometimes get very focused on very minute details, get very technical. I want to make sure that we really focus on the fact that we are fundamentally talking about how do we engage fans in sports. And we're all here because we love the game. We're all here because we love to engage with it in some way. And there's been a sports story, at least one, along the way that has helped inspire and drive that along. For me personally, that was in 1994. I was a student at the University of Minnesota and a long-time Bullets fan. Michael Wilbon was at the All-Star game, the NBA All-Star game, and wrote a column about searching for a Washington Bullets hat in Minneapolis. Now, could not find one. I had done the exact same search, desperately trying to find one, and so as a very long-suffering fan of the Bullets, I felt very seen. So I want to start off by asking each of our panelists to share one story in sports that was impactful for them and how they engaged in sports. So we'll start. Jackie, why don't you lead us off?
So I cheated. I chose two, and the reason I did that, so as you can tell by this panel, we have some people that are really, really talented with data and turning it into something that is easy for you to read and makes you say, wow, I didn't know that. My background is very, very different from everybody else here. I grew up in the Stone Age when we wrote stories without data because we didn't have data. And I still believe that to have great storytelling, I love data, but you still need to be able to interview people, show nuance in a story, show, not tell. That's the first thing you learn in journalism. Show us what you're talking about, not tell. So my first story was, I think, just an amazing story. It's by, I must confess, by a friend of mine, Wright Thompson, who wrote a long profile on Pat Riley. I don't know if any of you happened to read it. It was tremendous. It got to the very heart of a man who's very complicated and simply can't stop. And I think it was written a few years ago, so Wright Thompson was correct. There is not 1 ounce of data in this story, okay? Not 1 ounce. But to me, it's a great example of exemplary storytelling. But for the purpose of today's discussion, I found a story about Messi, the soccer player, and I don't even follow soccer, but everyone knows Messi, and how he's a better player walking than most soccer players are running. And it was by Bobby Gardner, and I think there was a MIT Sloan paper that had to do with this, and it was chock full of great data explaining how they could measure Messi's movements and how economical they were and how they made him one of the greatest players. I use these two as examples because if you really ask me, how can we make Wright Thompson's story better? I don't think it's possible to make a Wright Thompson story better. For the purposes of this discussion, one of the things Ben and I discussed was, in this story we talk about, again, Riley's own almost maniacal attention to detail. You guys may or may not know his players get tested for body fat. It was a problem for Shaq when he was there. It wasn't a problem for many other guys before or since. What I would have loved to add to that story, in the interest of our discussion, would have been, could we have a breakdown, and you guys can answer for me, of data that would tell us late in games, how do the Heat do against a team that might not be as well conditioned? Heart rates, all these kind of things. So that's how Wright's story. Now the Messi story, I would have just loved it if someone had talked to Messi, right? I'm not criticizing the story. I'm not. It's a really interesting story, and it caught my eye. But how about if we talk about to other players, because maybe Messi's hard to get. Yeah, it looks like he's not moving, and then the next thing you know, he scored a goal on you. All right, I've talked too much. I'm going to stop now. Go ahead, Jeff.
I was a baseball-obsessed youth. Anyone who knows me that would not find that surprising. When I was about 9, so I was playing in my town at the level right below Little League starting. An article came out in Sports Illustrated, which was a weekly periodical back then on Thursdays, hitting my mailbox. It was the baseball preview where literally the entire magazine was about the upcoming baseball season. So very far in the past this happened. And the article, it was an article in that magazine that had the tricks of the trade. This was baseball players present in the past telling a tell-all about how they cheat on turning a double play with the neighborhood play, or a first baseman stretching but his foot's not really on the bag, or Norm Cash, who I don't even remember as a player, but was giving the secrets of how to cork a baseball bat. And I thought, well, I unlocked the secrets. I'm going to be the best player in my town because I know all these things. And I'll be playing for the second base for the Red Sox someday because I can turn double play better than anybody else. It didn't work out that way, but that level of storytelling was like, I tried to immediately that baseball season do all those little cheaty things, which nowadays you couldn't get away with probably because of instant replay. Or if you could get away with it, you could, StatCast could quantify it in some way who really were the best people. It may be with the neighborhood play of not stepping on the bag and turning a double play. But I just thought that to be an absolutely fascinating article, kind of behind the scenes about baseball that I didn't know existed, a world. And then I try to use that for evil to get an advantage.
Okay, Rebecca?
Yeah, so mine is from 1996. I can't believe I'm going to say, like, the Kentucky basketball team in the Shane Battier room. Sorry, guys. But the 96 team was very impressionable on me as a young kid. They were undersized. Like, Rick Pitino is just an offensive genius, right? So for me, I was enamored by this team that really overachieved and constantly, their efficiencies on offense were just so fun to watch, but not quantifiable at the time. And so just being able to follow them for a season, and they ended up winning the national championship. And there was a local article that came out just kind of showcasing the talent on that team and how it really should not have been as successful as they were. And for me, I was like, man, this has really got my wheels turning, and I'm 6, 7 years old at the time. But it was very impressionable to me just to understand a little bit more about the way that they used to think about the game and not having deep data to be able to make these decisions, and then what can be done now is just kind of incredible to kind of take that, scale it, and look far in advance. And so the 96 team and a local Lexington, Kentucky article is the story that I'm sharing. That's you, Brent.
So I think I'll go the same route Jackie did, and I'll tell you the storytelling component that brought me into really love sports. I grew up around the game. My dad was a college hockey coach. I always played hockey. And I was going to school at Boston University. And John Buccigross wrote a story for ESPN.com. He had a column, I believe. And he covered one of the first Travis Roy golf tournaments. And I'm not going to talk a lot about this because I'll probably get emotional because I was there through a lot of those years. And the way John Buccigross covered it and the way he spoke about it was just so touching and moving. And in the end, the article ended with John Buccigross shooting a basket, asking if Travis Roy would ever walk again and putting it on the basket, because who hasn't done that in the driveway? Played Game 7 of the Stanley Cup Finals, took a shot, right? And like putting something meaningful on the game, but he was in golf cleats still, and he was shooting a basket in his driveway, thinking about the day. And the way he wrote about the tournament and he wrote about Travis and his teammates was just so touching and moving to me, because that's really beyond data. We try to humanize everything we do in the sport. It's a box score if we don't, right? It's really what it is. We try to humanize it and come up with a story behind it. So stepping out from the data, because I know we're going to talk a lot about that today, but that's the thing that really brought me in. And it's funny, I asked him about that, because I forgot the part where I actually sent him an email after I read that and told him how much it meant to me. And he replied. And years later, I was in a golf tournament with him. And he actually told me he remembered it, because it was in the very early stages of him doing that column, and he was trying to figure out how to connect with people and how to tell the story around it. And for me, that was the one that was just so moving and touching and endearing. So,
Great. Well, thank you for sharing. We touched on a lot of this in different ways as you guys shared those things. But Jackie, regardless of the form of the story, what are the elements of a great sports story?
So the first thing is someone better say early on, or at least when they're done, wow, I didn't know that, right? Tell me something you didn't know about a person that maybe you had a very different impression of. I think one of the most important stories I did when I was a young writer at the Boston Globe, and it took me 2 years to get it, was to get Patrick Ewing to sit down with me. Patrick Ewing grew up in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He came from Jamaica. He had some learning disabilities. He had a tough go of it. And then he had the audacity to choose Georgetown University to play his college basketball in instead of Boston College, which did not play well here.
It worked for us in DC, though. We like that.
Yes, well, he was tremendous. But he was a very quiet kid. He was protected very closely by John Thompson. He just didn't do a lot of interviews. But I knew some of those guys from Cambridge, Ridge, and Latin, and I knew what they thought of him. So I literally spent a year and a half going in the Knicks locker room before the game, and he would say, no interviews, and I'm like, no, I don't want to talk to you, I'm going to just talk to Allen Houston, you know. And I just hung around and locked him until I finally got him to sit down with me. And I learned so much about him that 2-year period. It took me a long time to get him to where he felt comfortable that I was going to tell his story in a way that was appropriate, in a way that he felt comfortable. And I learned so much about him. And of all the stories I've written, I was at the Globe at the time, I got more letters, because email was, I'm embarrassed to say, there was a very little bit of email, no cell phones or anything. Because people are like, wow, I thought he was a real jerk. I guess he's not, right? So to me, the best, and sometimes it's the other way around. Someone you think is really tremendous turns out to be not all what you thought. So I want to learn something from my storytelling. I want to be moved. I want to feel emotion when I'm reading the story. But I also want to make sure that the story is based on fact, is based on data would be great, but again, I'm talking about a different time.
Yeah. All right. Well, so you mentioned data, and the types of data and metrics available to storytellers and fans have grown dramatically over the last 20 years, sometimes controversially. Sports is now a data-rich environment. So, Rebecca, talk to us a little bit about what role data plays in telling great stories now.
Yeah, I kind of look at it from the perspective of the eye test. And when you're watching a game or you're watching a match, as a viewer, you sort of understand like good, bad. But what we can do with data now, and I'll kind of talk about the basketball side of things with Second Spectrum, is we got our start with pick and rolls and being able to kind of dive into that and understand a little bit more about the game itself. And from that, you can derive a lot of information and a lot of really cool nuggets that can be put out into the space and creating the storytelling. And now from the pick and roll days to now what we do with skeletal pose tracking and getting all of these different data marks, it's really interesting to see where the storylines will come now in specific shooting mechanics and what it looks like, or hey, we're piecing together, you know, what does it look like in the late game, like you were talking about, Jackie, of like, hey, are we better here in the conditioning, and where are we at in transition, and what does this look like? And so to be able to dive into that and have it as quickly as we can derive some of that data is really super impactful. and it's only going to get better.
Is there like one that just jumped out that you're like, wow, look at this. Like, look at this pattern. I can't believe it.
I mean, I think that when
Sorry,
you
I'm
look,
doing your job. I apologize.
Make my life easier. That's good.
no, I love it. It's our first year tracking with the WNBA was last season. And so being able to have Caitlin Clark data come in is just insane to be able to see how efficient she is in some of these actions. And so I was a shooter. I'm offensive minded. And so being able to dive into
38% from
that.
three.
Not bad.
Long time ago. But being able to dive in and understand her game and how quickly she can get a shot off, or how efficient she is coming left, like going to her left, is just insane to be able to kind of dig into that type of detail. So that's just one example of many, but we can highlight a few.
So, Jeff, you've probably been responsible for more data-driven sports stories than anybody else ever, given your time
Sure
at
about that.
ESPN.
I was there for a long time.
How do you create engaging stories with data?
So it starts with like knowing your data, like what's in the data set, and maybe more importantly, what's not in the data set, what is it not capturing? And then next stage is like, what's the questions? What do I want to ask of this? Sometimes you don't know, but hopefully you're curious and you have some set of 1 or 2 questions or more that you want to really focus on, do the analysis. You understand the output, hopefully, and then it's working on the communication piece, which is super critical. And mostly the role I played at ESPN post my on-air research part was when they had the analytics team. I certainly wasn't a coder or doing the modeling, but I was helping evangelize. So knowing the audience moves into a framework that I introduced for ESPN's graphics building team about a dozen years ago that I call the ABCs of on-air graphics. And a little bit cheating, there's 3 C's. So it's A, B, C, 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 and an S.
Rolls
plural.
off the tongue.
Yeah, ABCs, but people remembered. And A is for accuracy, which was not just alphabetically first, but the most important thing. If you have the best graphic or best storytelling for data, if it's inaccurate, then you just wasted everyone's time, your own time and the audience's time. B is for brevity, which I'm not doing a great job of right now, is tossing aside all the stuff that is not crucial to the story. So the clutter, if it's like a visual graphic or anything that can be like an editor would take out things that's not getting you to further the audience along in the journey. And then C's are where hopefully I don't mess this up. Clarity, so it has to be clear. It can't be confusing. You don't want to open up to other questions too. Hopefully you're answering a question and not leaving the audience asking new questions. Context, super important. Some sort of comparison or a time frame, or is this good? Like that should be part of the context. And we talked about this with creating metrics. Sometimes we create an awesome metric, and Brant will talk about that later, like without the back history of context, you have to really build up that language. And then the other C was for creativity. So this is storytelling. This is hopefully appealing in some way, visually, or taking someone through an imaginative narrative, or how you talk to the audience or the readers visually with your graph or graphic, really making sure you don't miss that step. And the S is for storytelling, which ties into this panel also. Like we are telling stories. It should arrive narratively when you're reading a beginning, middle, and end and have a takeaway, which is really challenging to do when your graphics on TV for 12 seconds. And it's being voiced over by somebody else that you wrote copy and hope they understood it and can voice it over. So that was a challenge of having other voices, but that's building up the trust as well. And knowing your audience, I can write this way for Stu Scott, the late great Stu Scott, but he was going to say it in his own voice, and I'd be crazy to write it. But if I wrote like this for Dan Patrick, well, he's going to say exactly how I wrote it, because that's how Dan does it. And I love Dan. But Dan was going to trust me and read it his own way.
Did anybody misuse your data?
All the time. You can use it for
Right?
people.
Because I think, people that aren't versed in it the way you are might say this, and like you mentioned the word context.
Yeah.
Like, do you have an example maybe of that? Or, I'm doing your job again. So I'm sorry.
My life
Are
easy.
you trying to trigger me here?
No.
I'm usually triggered. I had a thin skin for that. I don't know if anything comes example right away, but we created some metrics for the analytics team. In the early days of college football, we actually presented them here in 2014 in advance of the first year when they went from the BCS to the old 14 playoff. And we came up with some metrics on quantifying team. And one of the things we came up with in that moment was, in our research, and some of the people on that team are in this room right now, was understanding that it was the committee would have to wrestle with two big questions: deserving, but most deserving, and best. And everyone's just saying we're going to pick the 4 best teams, but no one knew what best meant. So we came up with, I thought, objective ways to look at those 2 questions, but people would spin that in a way to fit their own personal narrative.
Right.
And if our probabilistic projections, like a team had a 60% chance to like win a game, maybe people didn't think we're going to win. If that team lost, they would think it's wrong and throw it out and like discount the metric. So it was you had to build a lot of currency with certain talent.
Yep.
We've had talent trash our own stuff on the air, like compute. You know, it's awful. And I know Brent and I were talking about this previously in the green room. It's like the worst thing that for us who work on it and we really spend time thinking about this. And we are humans, and we have analysts who will say, well, the computer thinks Alabama's gonna whatever. Like, oh, it's not a computer. Like, it's not. There's people who
my
actually
name's Jeff.
actually love sports, and and we calibrate these things. And yes, we have a range of outcomes, but there are people who really this is their job.
Yeah. It is a challenge. So that's my title, but I actually do a lot of evangelism work around our products with our outlets and try to explain some different aspects of it and also help try to build some things that people can explain. And almost similar to your ABCCCs was the fact that we've come up with these 2 questions that we're always going to get asked no matter who we talk to, particularly on the broadcast side. Is that any good? And why does it matter? And it is 100% the scope we need to explain. So currently, we have something we're working on with AWS called opportunity analysis. It generates a projected goal rate on every shot attempt in the NHL and also provides 27 features and their impact on that score. It is a very open-faced machine learning algorithm. And I am not a data scientist. I work with great data scientists, and they make me look very good. I'm pointing at one of my teammates over there. So I can tell you right now, this is not a machine learning number. 5% approximately of all shots year over year become goals. I am not talking about shots on goal. I am talking about when a puck leaves a shooter stick. It's 5%. It is 5%. It is 5%. Let it be said, let it be known. So when you see a PGR on screen that is 7%, that's not bad, is it? And to summarize what Jeff just said, unless we provide what those averages are overall, people have a very tough time consuming that. Now, how do you get around that? Well, you have to find a way to cover this material with everybody involved. Generally, there's a sales team that's going to bring it to everybody else. Then you get to the producers. The producers have to say the talent they're gonna be okay with this. And once you unlock that, you have to, for anybody that's going to try to do this, please make sure you get time with the talent. Because if you hand a piece of paper to 4 people, it's gonna get crumpled, it's going to, figuratively of course, and the next thing you know, they're gonna read 5 seconds of it, if they read it at all, and then it's gonna pop up on screen, and they're gonna wing it. That's always the challenge with us. Because for me, everything we create needs to unlock our greatest talent. That's not just the talent on the ice and the storytelling about them, it's the talent we have in the booths, it's behind the typewriters and keyboards across the league, because they all have experiences, and we want to drop some nugget of information that unlocks their storytelling capabilities, from memory or otherwise. And if you don't get the complete story in front of the talent, it becomes very hard to actually have them buy into it, because they don't want to take a chance and be wrong. And they feel like if they're not going to stick up for themselves when something goes up on the screen, they're being silently compliant, if you would, right? That's a lot of what you've seen too, Jeff.
Yeah, and I think social media
all of you, sorry.
swung this in a way where they sometimes feel like they're blamed for it being wrong, like your face-off predictions, whatever. If it's or it's not predictions, right?
We changed it to probability for that very reason.
But like
right?
it's 56%, and the guy's at 44% wins it. Like, is it wrong? No, it's not wrong. Just the outcome.
Yeah.
Face-offs are coin tosses, right? The greatest centermen in history are, I think, around 60%, and if they are, that's amazing, right? Like. It's a weighted coin toss. That's all it is. And we're generating it live. And when I got to see that for the first time in a test environment from a press box, I watched a center get thrown out on the ice, and I looked down and I didn't see the numbers change. I'm like, well, this isn't a great start. And I looked back up and I realized before I could take my eyes off the ice and look at my laptop screen, it had already adjusted. And my mind was blown that we were able to run a model that quickly and output something that I was actually looking at live.
I'll just say
To me,
something
that's just such an
So
amazing story in and of
if
itself.
you have a statistic like that,
Yep.
where you're basically calling it a coin toss, how can you refine that to make it something that's usable? Because like if I would be afraid if I were you
Yeah.
to give that to anybody that isn't on board with what I'm doing.
It's a great point. And to some point, I don't think you mind the discussion because you want the argument to happen. You want, if you have someone between the benches and you have another analyst up in the booth, maybe they get into a debate about, yeah, but that player turns their hands over in a different way on face-offs. And the way that the defending center is trying to take that draw, he's always going to have an advantage there, and maybe that's coming through in the numbers. Like, that's the debate you want. You don't want somebody to completely pan it, right, from a place of, and I'm not saying this in a malicious way, of ignorance. They just don't understand it.
Right.
You will take the discussion. One of the things we learned from face-off probability, which gives you all four, that's the neat thing, it actually gives you the top four likely matchups that are going on the ice. With opportunity analysis and projected goal rate, we are trying to actually give you more information behind it to tell you why, right? So how far was the puck from the middle of the ice? How far was it from the goal line? What's the goaltender's angle? How much did the goaltender's angle change in the last quarter of a second, right? Like, to define it and have people understand it.
Is it possible to take, like, Bergeron was a good face-off guy, right?
One of the best.
Is it possible to take Bergeron and then say, okay, he's great at face-offs except for with this guy?
Yes.
Right? You could do that, right?
Oh, yeah. And I think it's even more, I mean, that's easy to do from historical information
Right,
alone.
right.
But what you want to do is say, who is this player like in this very situation? And that's how you develop it.
And one of the underlying themes here is like the change in latency, right? Like some of the things that have been talked about this conference 10, 12 years ago were like, we get them 72 hours afterwards. And now we're talking about you averting your eyes and thinking it didn't catch it, but you'd already accounted for it. And the stuff with Genius Sports and Second Spectrum with basketball.
It's remarkable.
And from a TV perspective, when I used to have those conversations with the production teams, like milliseconds we're talking, because you have to be the time frame, the window to tell that story is so quick on a game broadcast.
I had to stay up all night to break down scoring chances when I was with the Boston Bruins, right? And I was petrified that my head coach was going to take a number into the room, point at players and say that they were involved on it. With the stuff we build now and the stuff that you have, you're seeing that in like sub-seconds latency in a lot of cases, and it's just mind-blowing because it's not subjective either, right?
Yeah, none of it's subjective.
No.
That's the whole point, right?
No. Well, I mean, look, there's always something when you develop and you label, and there's some subjectivity that goes into it, but hopefully it's structured well enough that it gets washed out.
So I'm like really excited about Dean Oliver, who's just a genius anyway. He's got this net points. Like, I wish I still worked for one day, just one day, because I'm really excited to see what he's going to do with that data. And already, I was looking at, guys, Dean Oliver, I think he's on probably 2 or 3 panels today, but it's a new rating to rate NBA players. And he had the Golden State Warriors, you know, they started off very strong and then they went into a slump, and it had each net rating for each player before, you know, during the, I'm sorry, I don't have it in front of me, so the first 20 games, they were 17, whatever they were. And then things started to, you know, drop off, and you can see Curry's numbers going off a cliff. And it just was interesting to me that Kevon Looney was a plus before and after, not a big plus, but a plus, and it's why Steve Kerr can't let him go. You know? Anyway, I digress.
No worries. So let's shift explicitly to artificial intelligence and how it's impacting everything in this world now. You know, Rebecca, live sports is one of the last truly communal experiences that we have. How is storytelling during live events impacted by new technologies, both in terms of data collection and AI and the overall fan experience?
Right. One of my favorite parts of what we can do with the data is during broadcast augmentations and live kind of deliveries of highlighting important pieces of data and making it relatable to the end viewer, the end consumer, right? And so if you've ever been watching a basketball game and you've kind of seen some of these floating halos that are under the players that are highlighting shot probabilities, it's showing you at the time, wherever the ball handler is and you know, in proximity to the goal, what the actual shot probability if you were to shoot it right there. And you can get super granular in that. There's a bunch of different data points that come into a shot probability, but what is most interesting to the viewer, right? It's understanding, like when Steph comes across half court, his probability is going to be much different than anyone else, right? And understanding how you portray
Except for
that.
Caitlin Clark.
And Caitlin Clark. super high numbers, just insane.
Yeah.
Insane. But the ability to bring these things to life in either graphics and visualizations, and again, the latency piece is huge, right? It can't, Jeff, to your point, like the time and the window in order to tell a certain story within that is just huge. So being able to have all of this data coming across and being able to share these insightful things that help take the viewer from a kind of we'll call it like a leisurely viewer, and educate them in the game to where they're coming back and they're learning more each time. And so whatever that looks like, we've found from basketball, obviously, in a lot of sports, offense drives a lot of that ability to tell storylines. And so being able to highlight some of these things and where players are located, where they're going, probabilities, all of that really plays into bringing that in as a
Can you
live.
explain to me, the layperson on this panel, how does AI do that for you?
Yeah. So as what we're doing with the optical tracking is, hey, we've got these cameras in the arena and they're tracking ball and player a bunch of times a second. And so what we do is we lay an AI layer here. It's basically machine learning that's teaching the computer how to view the game through the lens of a coach. And so that's the AI layer coming across saying, hey, you have Steph Curry coming across half court. We know exactly where this pick and roll is going to occur. We know that someone's in the dunk position, someone is not over in the opposite side corner. And being able to take all of that tracking data and lay it across with AI and machine learning, bring that language of the sport to life, to where you can say this
Within
is actually
seconds,
digestible and it's happening in milliseconds. And so it's just fascinating to be able to do that. We've got a group of our engineers in here that just do incredible work and make this thing come to life for all of us in here. But yeah, it's kind of a beautiful pod of all of these things coming together, Jackie, to where it's the tracking, your machine learning, your AI, and just bringing it to a place where the end consumer can understand what you're trying to teach.
Yeah.
And I'll throw this back to you, Jackie, right? I mean, the fact is that you get these numbers on a player, but if there's a story that went on before the game that was covered, and now people are watching the game and they're actually tying that in. One of my favorite song quotes of all time, Brian Fallon of the Gaslight Anthem, all of our heroes are failures and ghosts, right? We don't want heroes to be like untouchable. You want to know the failures behind somebody or the struggles, because then you appreciate their successes that much more. But that's where the storytelling aspect of it, I think, is always going to be there, right? And being able to look at a stack of data and say, isn't that interesting? Alexander Ovechkin, somebody made a comment on a podcast recently that he's still scoring from the same areas of the ice. Sure, he does, but he's actually moving around a lot more than he has in previous years. He scored one the other night, and he was almost in the paint when he scored it, right? And knowing that storytelling is there, but being able to go back and look and say, yeah, but he is moving around more, right?
And some of the genius, I would assume, is because everyone knows that. Everyone knows where his office is.
They do.
But they can't stop
But
it.
he's playing with different players now,
Yeah.
too, right? So is it the bullish nature of Tom Wilson just charging through the offensive zone and he's just picking up pieces more than having to snipe from his office like he used to? I mean, like, there's the story, though, right? And it's the perspective that different people are going to have to tell the story.
So I think, like, for people like me who originally, when I heard AI, I was like, no, because I wasn't thinking of it in these terms. I was thinking of it that someone was going to take something that I wrote and automate it and make it sound even better. I don't know. And I think that part of AI for writers is problematic, obviously, for obvious reasons. And I think I actually talked to a couple of my former ESPN colleagues before I came on this panel. I said, are you using AI GPT? Are you using that? And they said, yeah, we use it for games where we're not staffing, and we take data and we put it in, and it's, all right, so I don't care about that, because that's not, in my mind, that's informative. That's not storytelling. What you guys are talking about is storytelling. So I think there's a distinction to be made.
Absolutely. And,
Yeah.
and I'm not going to ask you a question.
Okay.
How would you advise new storytellers, new writers, to engage with AI in this new world of data as they're getting started and trying to figure out the best way to tell stories in this new world?
Well, I would say if they don't, they're going to get left behind. I know when I worked at ESPN for, I guess, 20 years, and at one of that point, I don't know, Henry Abbott is here today, True Hoop, he's terrific. He was a cutting edge guy that was involved in all this, and he was my NBA editor for a time. And I really learned a tremendous amount from him because, again, my training was not, I understood the value of data, but I didn't know how to necessarily implement it. But most importantly, I didn't know which questions to ask.
Right.
And that's where you guys come in. So I have this little piece of paper here. Yeah. This is a story that I wrote, I think in 2015. And it was after the Spurs had beaten, I'm obviously an NBA writer, after the Spurs had beaten the Heat. Now remember, the year before they lost because data suggested that Tim Duncan was not the best defender on that inbounds pass, and the Spurs people will all put a pox on you because they scored by taking Tim Duncan out. Yeah. You know, that's the kind of stuff I think you guys are talking about. Don't blame the messenger there. You know, the ball took a funny bounce. Anyway, so the Spurs win, and I went out because it was one of the most incredible performances I had ever seen. And I don't know how many of you remember, but they had an ability, they were passing the ball over the floor like I had never seen. So your eye test, right? So I'm like, I said, Henry, don't you feel like that was like maybe the best passing that's ever been done? And so second spectrum, this was my first experience with it. Yep. We went probably to you, Jeff,
or
and your group. And anyway, so this story was a great story. It ended up being a great story because, number one, we got pop. So that's storytelling. We have someone talking about losing in the most excruciating way known to man. They were like, they had the ropes up. They were bringing the trophy out. And then turning it around and realizing we have to be almost perfect. They call it the 3 seconds or less, which is his rule. They call it summertime, passing the ball around and around and around. So we got all of that. We got the players talking about how they got LeBron and the Heat into what they call the mixer, which is when the ball's moving so fast you can't keep up defensively. So all of that on its own would have been a nice story. But Henry said to me, let's find out. So these are the numbers. I had looked it up. This is in what NBA.com tracking data and Second Spectrum told us that in the 2014 finals, the Spurs passed the ball 472 times more than the Heat. Okay? But this is the part that's unbelievable. In games 3 through 5, I know this is rudimentary for most of you. You guys are all well ahead, but this just blew me away. And this is how I'm going to, like any young writer should try this. In games 3 through 5, they averaged 157 more passes per game. Per game. That's crazy. Yeah. That's crazy.
And it's equal possession, essentially. Like, each team has the same amount of possessions.
Well, this is it.
It's not like football, where you could just run like 50 more plays.
Right. And then what, of course, happened, because the NBA is a copycat league, like actually all of the leagues, the league average of passing went up an average of 4.5 passes per game across the board. So this is when I realized, okay, I don't want to miss this boat, because this boat is going to take everything I write about and make it so much better.
So I'm going to ask one more question, then we'll get to some audience questions. So Rebecca, when you think about the future, where this is going, what do you think is the most exciting possibility for the future of storytelling with data?
Yeah, I think for the way that we view the future, it's an individual experience for every end user, right? And so the way that I think the next thing that is really taken ground here is kind of the 3D virtual recreated world. And a lot of what we're doing now is bringing all of the data that these teams and these broadcasters have access to, and now putting it into this place to where you can see a first-person view of what it looks like for Caitlin Clark as she comes off a double screen, and you're able to kind of see in that world, what does it look like for her to get this open shot. And so as I think about storytelling from that particular regard, is just the way that you can get all of that data into a customized kind of space for your end viewer, but then being able to say, all right, this will be different for Brant than it would be for myself. But things like that, the 3D recreated world, taking skeletal pose tracking and being able to derive a ton of different data points from that, and how that becomes a story within itself, and being able to peel back all of those layers and how that looks is probably what gets me most excited about the future of that storytelling.
In addition to what Jackie was talking about, where ESPN was using Gen AI to be additive for maybe leagues or games that they don't have staffing for, ESPN is also using AI to customize, kind of like to your point, with something we call SportsCenter for you, letter, very clever, maybe. And that's going to be like, customize that where, you need some inputs though. It needs to know something about the user. You know, like favorite teams. So if you go in the app and your favorite teams, the more information you can share, because it's all built on data, then the more customizable experience you'll have where, unlike a producer producing a Sports Center on linear TV and saying, this is what America, we're going to start with, lead off the Cowboys, and then we're going to move on to LeBron, and then there's other stories. Like you can be like, no, these are the teams I follow, these are the stories I care about, and you'll have it's not going to be like every single user can have their own Sports Center, but there'll be like 50 Sports Centers that more closely match the similarity score of the user. So, but it's all predicated on how much the user shares about themselves that it learns from.
We're definitely in that category with our train of thought at the National Hockey League. Like, we want to create these customized environments for users in general, right? And the AI is a big component of that. Don't make somebody go in and fill out a checklist every time. Remember what they did. Make new suggestions. It's that easy. I mean, that's such a simple way to make sure that when somebody tunes in, they stay tuned in.
Many of us have kids, and they're growing up like algorithms,
15 seconds.
Run their lives, for better or for worse sometimes. But they are used to the content that they care about, and not what someone thinks they should be talking about or caring about.
That's why I love Zach Lowe, man. Zach Lowe.
All right. So
somewhere good.
so I got a question from the audience, and this is a jump ball. So whoever wants to jump in here, how do you balance using data to tell a story to the average fan versus more advanced data for the data wonk who is watching and more fluent in it?
So I think you can't yada past the best part to get Seinfeldian for a second. You kind of have to bring it up from the bottom, right? You can't have this really derived, sort of inconclusive thing you throw up on the screen and expect buy-in. When you guys built something so deep in QBR, we didn't really touch on that, but and that took a while to get buy-in. It was ready, but to make it to Monday Night Football took a long time, right? From what you said. So how do you maybe have some components along the way that you can explain to people that then fit into that final component that you're really trying to get people to use? I think that's one way to do it. You kind of have to build it slowly.
I mean, some of it is really understanding your audience. So from a TV's perspective, earlier in my career, I worked on Sports Center for 4 years, which is more of a general, and back then we covered all sports. And then I worked on Baseball Tonight for 4 years, which obviously is a opt-in baseball-centric audience. And when I did a baseball graphic for Sports Center, sometimes I was talking to an audience that wasn't baseball fans, or at least hardcore baseball fans. So it was more general storytelling. And when I was doing something for Baseball Tonight, I was assuming I had like expert level, and I didn't want to talk down to the audience. And I wanted them to be like, I couldn't get that anyplace else but Baseball Tonight. So I think whatever the forum is, long form journalism, Boston sports newspapers, or a national platform, or a game audience, knowing who your audience is, the demographics, and trying to tailor that a little bit so it's understand and it kind of resonates with them.
Jump off of that one real quick, Ben. It's from an altcast perspective, if you have different modes that you can tap into, you'll have a mode that's just very basic data points that you're bringing to life, and you're activating that with graphics on the screen, and then maybe you toggle between more of a coach mode, and you want to understand the tactics around what's happening on the screen and being able to kind of bring that to life. So options, that individual experience with an altcast, I think that's also a great tool.
Have you hacked our Zoom sessions? I mean, it sounds like everything that we're talking about on our calls. I mean, it's true. You want to, we have animated broadcasts that you've probably seen, and the future isn't just like, hey, tonight's going to be Big City Greens generated off of our tracking data during games. You can choose your characters that you want to watch if you're trying to get your kid more into watching hockey.
All right, I'm going to try and squeeze in one last question here because we're getting close on time, but this was interesting from the audience. You spoke about data being misused, particularly by colleagues in other roles. Can you expand on strategies to prevent this and how to address it after the fact?
That's you, Jeff.
Yeah, I could
You
go
took
a
the
lot.
biggest breath, so
I'm looking at the clock. I don't have enough time to answer this. It's building trust, right? So it is a personal relationship, and you were in some of those meetings. Like we would meet with Mike and Mike, Mike Greenberg and Mike Golick, and sometimes we'd listen to the show. Like we were listening. We were saying like, what Are they using it the right way? How do I get through to them? And this is like knowing your audience, but internal, like self-scouting. Like this is our voice. I'm not on mic and mic. I'm not talking about it. I need them to convey the data that's interesting in their form, that works for them and their styles. Greenberg is going to be this, and Golick is going to be that, and they're different. That's what makes them great together. But give them feedback and hopefully build that trust. We're trying to help them. We are giving them tools to engage with the audience, and this is sometimes a big stretch for them. But yeah, you're building that trust both ways, and then also knowing when to cut bait. Like this is never, Charles Barkley is never going to be the voice for this, but this other person could be, and build that relationship.
Was there a directive from above? Did they go to Mike and say, look, this is good information. We want you to give this a try?
Sometimes Norby Williamson would come over the top.
Love Norby.
And
Love
like,
Norby.
hey, stats analytics, they're great, use them. But it wasn't the same to my knowledge. I mean, really it was us on the front lines talking to people and just like, don't be scared. We're here to help. And one of the things I think we identified was over time, more people who are the former players and coaches who work for ESPN were going to be coming from organizations that used analytics. Right. But in 2012, that was not the case. Right. It was a very scary, they're coming for my job kind of situation, almost similar to AI.
Time fixes everything that way.
Yeah.
So clearly there's always going to be a human role here. So that's good to know. All right. Thank you, everybody. This is a great panel. Excellent discussion.